There is an official government report from 1863 that describes something American engineers were finding beneath the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, mines that had been abandoned long before the modern mining industry arrived. The report was written by Charles Whittlesey and published by the Smithsonian Institution as Ancient Mining on the Shores of Lake Superior. Whittlesey was not a treasure hunter searching for a lost civilization. He was documenting ancient mine workings encountered in a region rapidly becoming one of America's most important copper districts. And what those engineers found created a problem much larger than the discovery of copper itself. They expected to find a mineral frontier. Instead, they found evidence that someone had already been mining it. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula, ancient pits followed the same copper-bearing formations that modern companies were beginning to exploit. Some were shallow depressions, others were substantial excavations, with piles of broken rock and traces of old workings. Whittlesey mapped the locations and described tools and structures associated with the ancient mines. The landscape itself was revealing a forgotten industrial history. But who had done this work? And how long before the arrival of European miners had it begun? The first answer came from archaeology. The copper around Lake Superior is unusual because much of it occurs as native copper, metal that can sometimes be recovered without first smelting an ore. In the 19th century, this made the region extraordinarily attractive to prospectors. Modern mining companies rushed into the Keweenaw during the 1840s, searching for rich deposits. Ancient mine pits sometimes revealed where copper-bearing veins reached the surface. Later industrial miners even used evidence of earlier indigenous workings as clues to promising deposits. What had looked like mysterious holes in the forest could actually mark the location of valuable copper. Then archaeologists began examining the old workings more closely. They found stone hammers and mauls, many made from hard volcanic rock. They found trenches, pits, waste material, and evidence that people had deliberately followed copper-bearing veins into the bedrock. The National Park Service describes thousands of ancient mining pits across the Keweenaw, some reaching more than 30 feet deep and up to roughly 120 feet across. But the tools created another mystery. How could people working without steel drills, explosives, or modern machinery break through solid rock? The answer was fire. Ancient miners could heat a rock face with intense fire and then rapidly cool it with water. The sudden temperature change caused the rock to fracture. Once the stone had cracked, miners could remove pieces using hammerstones and other simple tools. This technique required knowledge of both the rock and the copper-bearing formations. It sounds primitive, but it was not simple. This was knowledge being applied repeatedly across a landscape, and likely passed between generations. And that changed the question. The mystery was no longer simply who discovered copper. It was how generations of indigenous miners learned to find it, extract it, work it, and move it through a region dominated by forests, rock, and one of the largest freshwater lakes on Earth. Modern archaeology has pushed the story far deeper into the past than 19th-century investigators could have imagined. Researchers studying the old copper complex have examined radiocarbon dates associated with copper artifacts in mining contexts. A major study evaluated 53 radiocarbon dates and found organic materials associated with copper artifacts dating from roughly 8,500 to 3,580 calibrated years before present. The researchers concluded that the old copper complex represents one of the oldest known metalworking traditions in the world. That is where the story becomes difficult to comprehend. We are not talking about a forgotten mine from a few centuries ago. We are looking at a technological tradition stretching across thousands of years. And that leads to the question that has fascinated researchers for generations. If people extracted so much copper from Lake Superior, where did it go? And that makes the question of trade even harder to answer. The lake was not only a barrier, it was also a route. So the missing copper should not automatically be treated as evidence of a vanished transoceanic civilization. That possibility has appeared in popular theories, but the archaeological evidence does not require it. Modern archaeological research identifies the ancient miners as indigenous societies of the Great Lakes region. The National Park Service notes that archaeology, radiocarbon dating, geology, oral tradition, and historical records can be combined to understand these ancient mining sites. Still, another mystery remains. How far did the copper travel? And this is where the old 19th century record becomes important again. When Whittlesey documented the ancient workings in 1863, he had no radiocarbon dating, no modern geochemical analysis, and no way to reconstruct thousands of years of indigenous trade networks. But he could see the landscape. He could document the pits. He could record the tools. And he could recognize that the mining was ancient. His report, published by the Smithsonian Institution in 1863, preserved observations that helped establish the existence and distribution of prehistoric mine workings around Lake Superior. More than a century later, archaeology added something Whittlesey could never have known. The story was much older than 19th-century investigators imagined. The mines were not the remains of a mysterious lost European colony. They were part of a long indigenous history. And that fact makes the story more fascinating, not less. Because the real achievement is extraordinary on its own. People living thousands of years ago recognized exposed copper, located deposits beneath the surface, developed techniques for extracting metal from hard rock, created tools for working it, and participated in networks through which copper objects moved across the Great Lakes region. No lost European empire is required. No vanished civilization from across the Atlantic is necessary. The evidence already points to a remarkable indigenous technological tradition. But one question still refuses to disappear. Why were so many of the ancient workings abandoned? At some point, individual pits stopped being used. Forests returned. Soil accumulated. Trees grew over old excavations. Modern miners later encountered those traces and began asking who had been there before them. But when a landscape contains thousands of ancient workings spread across a major copper region, abandonment becomes part of the mystery. The forest hides the evidence. Archaeology brings it back, and the deeper researchers look, the less the story resembles a simple tale of a lost mine. It becomes the story of a technological tradition that survived for thousands of years and left traces in rock, soil, artifacts, and memory. The most important lesson may be the simplest one. When 19th-century American engineers arrived in the Keweenaw, they believed they were entering an untouched mineral frontier. They were wrong. They had entered an ancient mining landscape. The mines were already there. The copper was already being extracted. And the knowledge required to work those deposits had existed for thousands of years before the modern United States turned the region into an industrial mining district. But the landscape still holds unanswered questions. How many generations worked these deposits? How extensive were their exchange networks? How much copper was actually removed? And how much of that metal was transformed so completely that its original journey can no longer be reconstructed? Those questions are more powerful than the old stories of mysterious outsiders, because they lead us toward a history that is both extraordinary and supported by evidence. The title of this story may suggest that America was never meant to find these mines. The reality is more interesting. The mines were not waiting for modern America to discover them. They had already been discovered thousands of years earlier. What was lost was not the knowledge of copper itself. What was lost was our memory of the people who had mastered it. And perhaps that is why the old pits matter so much. They are not simply holes in the ground. They are evidence of decisions made by people who lived thousands of years ago. Where to dig, where to build fires, which rock to break, which copper to keep, and where to carry it next. The forest eventually covered their work, but it did not erase it. And more than a century after Charles Whittlesey documented those ancient workings, archaeology is still uncovering the story hidden beneath the trees. So the final mystery is no longer whether ancient people mined copper around Lake Superior. They did. The real questions are how far their copper traveled, how their knowledge was passed from generation to generation, and what parts of that ancient network disappeared without leaving a record. What do you think happened to the copper that never appears in the archaeological record? And how much more of this ancient mining landscape is still waiting to be found? If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through archaeology, original records, and evidence, consider subscribing for more.